You will find what I present relevant also for other contexts. I am going to talk about Turkey. My main interests are really intercultural communication, communication between different groups, and role of new media, especially social media, within all these processes. So I will be talking about the recent research that I conducted in the last years. My main question here was, we have all been using social media for a while. What is then the role of social media for connecting us, basically, to people of different opinions? So does social media play a role for mediating between different groups, making them understand each other better, maybe also for deconstructing stereotypes? This was the main starting point that I had in mind. And in order to be able to answer this question, I did a qualitative study, which is not always very typical for social media research, but I think it's very important to have in-depth approaches to understand the backgrounds, to understand why people do certain things, what people think, and why do they think the way they think, you know. But before I start to present the research methods and the results, maybe to say a couple of things about the theoretical background. This question is not a new question. It has been researched since the beginning of the internet. People have been interested in this question, how does the internet contribute to social contact between different groups? And the question of social contact is an even older question in social psychology, especially. You see different disciplines have been dealing with this question. One of the main fields that deal with social contact is psychology, social psychology. There is this hypothesis that different groups in the society, if they come into contact with each other, if they have some kind of relationship, they will have less prejudices against each other. There is the famous thesis by Pettigrew, who is a social psychologist, and this idea has been tested over the years. There has to be certain conditions for this to happen. So not any kind of meeting between different people will lead to the construction of stereotypes, but if certain conditions are met, you can see better results. I'm not going to go into the details now, maybe in the discussion we can think about that. But also political science deals with this question. They look at cross-cutting, what they call cross-cutting exposure, so being exposed to opinions of other people outside of your own group. Or cultural studies, communication studies have been dealing with interethnic, intercultural contact. Intercultural communication is very much about these kind of relationships, how difference is being articulated through encounters between different cultural groups, and how this changes people, for example. One last keyword here that I would like to use is network heterogeneity. This is more in communication studies and political science, and it's very much studied through a quantitative lens. So this field of research is looking at how heterogeneous the network structures of people are and how they kind of communicate within this heterogeneity. So this is a relevant term for me. I will come back to this. I am also looking at how heterogeneous people's friendship networks are, people's Twitter networks are, and what this means for them in the end. One other thing that I would like to mention in terms of the context of Turkey, because this research is done in Turkey, especially in Istanbul, but Istanbul is kind of like a microcosmos for Turkey with 15 million people, and you can find people of all backgrounds, like working class background, Kurdish people, Alevi people, immigrants, you know, like it's a small sample of Turkey. That's why I chose to do the study in Istanbul. I also live in Istanbul. Turkey is a highly polarized country. You might know about this. It has always been a bit polarized, especially along the ethnic lines and the sectarian lines. So the majority of the population in Turkey today is Muslim, of Muslim origin, but there are different orientations. I think there are around 13, 14 million Alevis, and the rest are Sunnis, but there is a quite strong division between these groups. They have a social distance towards each other, and there is the Kurdish conflict, you might all know. It is an armed conflict today, but it's a conflict of over 100 years. So there is also this fault line. And there was always the fault line between the more secular people and the conservatives, religious conservatives. Today, this fault line transformed into a polarization between party lines. So it is more a division between AKP supporters and AKP opposers. This is a very strong fault line today. And one thing that we should also say, this distance is also reflected in social life. If you look at the recent surveys, people say, for example, if they don't like Kurds, they also say, I don't want to be neighbors with them, I don't want my kids to marry with them, etc. So what I am looking at is how this all reflects in social media, these kind of fault lines. Are they reflected there, or are there any ways of breaking these fault lines through the internet? That's an important question. So the research questions are, how do Turkish internet users deal with political differences in social media? And how does increasing polarization and censorship influence social media of Turkish internet users? I didn't mention censorship yet. Maybe I should say 2 words about that too. You might again know that there is increasing censorship in Turkey, and there is an authoritarian tendency. This also is true for social media and the internet. Many people are being charged of their tweets for doing propaganda, terror propaganda, or for insulting the president, for example. There are a lot of court cases because of people's social media posts, so there is a lot of pressure on social media as well. People feel surveilled in a sense, so it's not very easy, and this is something that you will also see in the examples that I show you in a minute. What were the methods that I used? As I said in the beginning, I mainly adopted qualitative research methods, and my approach was here theoretical sampling, meaning that I was looking for different people. Every time that I looked for a new person, I tried to find someone who would tell me something new, who had a different background. I also tried to have as many diverse people as possible in terms of age, gender, education level, religious and ethnic backgrounds, because it was very important for my research question. And I did semi-structured interviews, so I had a guideline, but I had open questions, trying to make people talk as much as possible about their experiences. One last thing that I had was ego-centered network diagrams. We used this in another research in Bremen, which was about migration and media, which proved to be quite fruitful as a material to talk in the interviews. It doesn't tell you much. I will show you an example, but you could talk about these networks in the interview. So you ask the people to draw a network, to draw their own network in the way that they imagine it, putting themselves in the center. You will see the example. It's a very simple thing, but it's a good exercise. That was also something that I used. Coming to the research findings, first of all, I would like to say a couple of general things about network heterogeneity, because I was interested in this. First of all, how heterogeneous are the networks? Here, you could clearly see the people who had more moderate political positions, who were not extreme in their party affiliations, who were not extreme in their political identifications. They had more network diversity, so they were connected with more people. I think education level, I didn't write it here, but education level was also an indicator, because the more you study, the more you come into contact with other people, you have more opportunities. And that was another thing, but it's not always something that determines the network heterogeneity, I also have to say. I will in a minute show a quote from a taxi driver that I talked to. He had a very diverse network of people because he was in touch with so many people in his everyday life. So it's not always directly correlated with education level, but generally education level is an indicator for network heterogeneity. And the party lines here was not the thing that determined the heterogeneity. So there were AKP supporters and CHP supporters who had quite heterogeneous networks, and there were people from both parties who had less heterogeneous networks. So it's pretty independent from party lines. It was more about the person's own patterns. And what you could also see was a correlation between the heterogeneity of online and offline networks. So if a person is in touch with various people in her everyday life, then the social networks, you would probably expect that, but still it was interesting to see that there is a correlation. But the online networks were more heterogeneous. When I asked people if they are in touch with people in different backgrounds in their everyday lives, they said they are basically more in close contact with people, like-minded people, but in online networks, most of them had also people from different backgrounds. So online networks are still a bit more heterogeneous. So this is an example of a network diagram that you can see. So this is what I asked them to do. This is the Facebook network. So I asked them to do it for Facebook and for Twitter. These are the main platforms that people use in Turkey. That's why I also focused on them and a bit on WhatsApp. I will talk about that too. So I asked them to differentiate their networks into groups, and I didn't tell them anything. Most of them had a couple of categories like this. So you can see I also have the English words for that. So this was someone who is what is the name? Doctor for pets, I'm sorry. Veterinarian, yes, the same word in Turkish. He's a veterinarian, works in a state institute, so he's in touch with a lot of different people. And in his Facebook page, he also has, for example, people like pet owners and colleagues who are also veterinarians. And of course, you would typically expect relatives, university friends. I guess these are the categories that we would also have. But he also had categories like people whom I know but I am not close to. This is a 25-year-old male interviewee, by the way. People who I would not greet on the street, and colleagues. So you see, this is a much more heterogeneous network than what you have in your everyday life. You add people like this. I don't know if it's the same in Spain, but in Turkey, people are pretty generous about whom to add on their contacts. I think this is very different in Germany, for example. They are very strict about adding people who they know. In Turkey, average is like 600-700 friends on Facebook, so it's pretty large. You meet someone, you just add them on Facebook. These are different norms, I guess. This is also important. What is interesting here is, so from these categories, not all of them are as heterogeneous. For example, good friends are mostly like-minded people. Of course, if you are more like a left critical person, okay, see. You will also choose your good friends from these group of people. Your colleagues might be heterogeneous because you don't get to choose them, depending on where you work. And the people who you know, who you are not close to, or pet owners, for example, these are the groups which you can call the weak ties. You might know this term. So these are the people who bridge you to different communities, different opinions. This is very important. So this is why social media can play such a role. But when it comes to the question, so this is about the network heterogeneity, it looks pretty optimistic. But when I ask them how do they deal with this heterogeneity, what do they do when they see someone who thinks differently than them, I saw that there were different strategies. One was observing. So some people said, I read everything what others write, I learn from them, it's interesting. So this is probably the most the category that has most potential because they care about others' opinions. The second was ignoring. So they ignored what the others thought, so they were not interested in them. They didn't even read them, or maybe they put them on silence. They didn't follow them. There was a more extreme strategy of deleting and blocking. I will show you an example in a minute. Another strategy is debating, really actively debating with other people on your own wall or on others' walls, like really trying to convince the others or try to enter into a debate. Last one is self-censorship. So choosing not to write because you fear to be controlled by others or to face sanctions. So one example for blocking from the interviews, this is a male draftsman. He's not a university graduate, but he learned it through working. So he said, basically, to summarize, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I asked him, what do you do when you see different opinions? He's like, especially if they're AKP supporters, I don't even read, I just delete them or block them from my list. So this is pretty much really cutting contact. There is no social contact here, you can see. The second example is about debating. So in democratic theory, especially liberal democracy, you would think debating is very important in the public sphere. That's how you come to a consensus. You have to have some kind of rational debate. You would think right away maybe this is a positive thing, but when you read carefully here, he says, I will read the last part only, my aim is to tell certain people about the truth. When I tell them the truth, I feel relieved. I have people from all backgrounds, from everywhere, especially from the Taxi Drivers Association. So this is the taxi driver that I was talking about. He's debating a lot, but his aim is not to really have a rational debate, but to convince others about what he thinks the truth is. So this is also already a very strong position entering into debate. But still there is a social contact. You can say this is also still more positive than just ignoring the others. The last example I have is about self-censorship. I'm coming to the end. My last slide is coming. So she says, she's a journalist and she was quite active also in politics. She says, I commented more before. I would always add something in the beginning or in the end of the links that I share. But now she's more scared. She says this is auto mechanism. I don't want to go to jail, at least not for this. So if it was something more important, I could even think about that. But I don't want to go to jail for a social media post. So this is how much people fear of expressing their opinion. Coming to my conclusion of my previous question in the beginning, I can say social media has the potential for providing social contact spaces. So you get into touch with more diverse people. This is true for many people, especially these weak ties are very important. But these contact spaces do not necessarily or automatically change people's opinions. You don't change your opinion because you read someone else's post. Still, this contact is important. If you don't have this contact, you are not going to have any opportunity to understand the other side. Many people also had a narrative of change in their social media use. Many said they had, for example, moments, very peak moments of polarization, like elections, the polls, the recent referendum, for example, where they had fights with their close friends or with the weak ties. So it's not always as tense, but there are tense moments where you tend to have more fights on social media and you delete the people. So your network gets more and more homogeneous, which is dangerous, I think. And many people also reported, especially critical people, not the AKP supporters maybe, that they fear and they self-censor themselves when they are posting online. Or they prefer to have anonymous accounts. That's also a trend. Like on Twitter, many people change their names to anonymous names. Last point, I couldn't talk much about that. There is a move from social media towards closed WhatsApp groups, Instagram, instant messaging groups, which are more homogeneous for discussing politics. So you wouldn't write your political opinion on your Facebook wall, but you would prefer to share your opinion on a closed and safe WhatsApp group. So this was also a trend. This is the Turkish context. I would be very interested to hear if this could connect in any way with, for example, recent debates and recent tensions that are happening here in Spain or in other parts of the world. I hope this can open up a bit of a discussion in that regard. Thank you very much.